The morning I realized my business partner had quietly redirected $900,000, I didn't confront him, and I didn't call my lawyer, not yet. I went still in a way that only comes when a lifetime of experience finally snaps something into focus. Because betrayal in business doesn't usually arrive with shouting or slammed doors. It arrives with spreadsheets, friendly emails, and a smile that assumes you're too tired or too old to check the fine print. Before I take you deeper into how the man I built a company with decided to erase me from it, let me ask you something. Where are you listening from right now? Are you at home, commuting, or lying awake replaying decisions you wish you made differently? Drop your place in the comments so I know you're here with me. And if you value realistic revenge stories, the kind rooted in patience, intelligence, and quiet strength, please like this video. Your support genuinely keeps these stories coming. My name is Helen Carter. I'm 67, American-born, and I live in Ohio. For 30 years, I ran operations, negotiated contracts, and built systems that survived recessions and egos far bigger than mine. When I partnered with Mark, it wasn't because I needed him. It was because I trusted him. We shook hands over shared values, shared risk, and a promise we both signed: transparency. I brought the structure, he brought the charm. Together, we grew the company from a modest regional firm into something national. Or so I thought. What I didn't see, what I didn't want to see, was how familiarity can dull vigilance, how success can make people impatient, and how some men mistake a woman's calm for consent. By the time the numbers stopped adding up, Mark had already convinced himself the company was his, and that I would never notice what was missing. For years, the partnership worked the way all good partnerships do, quietly and efficiently. I handled compliance, vendor negotiations, and long-term planning, the unglamorous work that keeps a company standing when trends shift. Mark handled clients, presentations, and visibility. He loved the spotlight and I never needed it, so the balance felt natural. But as the company grew, so did the complexity of our finances, and that's where things began to tilt. Mark suggested restructuring how funds flowed between subsidiaries, calling it an efficiency upgrade. He forwarded reports prepared by an outside firm he'd chosen, explaining that it would streamline oversight and reduce administrative burden. I reviewed them, of course, but the changes were layered and incremental. No single red flag, no obvious theft. Just subtle rerouting, new line items, and language that made everything sound routine. When I asked questions, Mark responded with confidence and familiarity, reminding me that growth required flexibility, that I didn't need to carry every detail anymore. He wasn't dismissive, he was reassuring. And that made it easier to step back slightly, to trust that the systems we'd built together were still serving us both. What I didn't realize then was that while I was managing the company, Mark was managing perception, mine included. The first real warning didn't come from a balance sheet. It came from silence. Payments that used to require my sign-off stopped appearing in my inbox. Monthly summaries arrived later than usual, thinner somehow, as if entire conversations had been edited out before reaching me. When I asked Mark about it, he laughed it off, saying the new accounting software was still syncing, that the transition period always looked messy. He said it the way people do when they expect you to accept inconvenience as the cost of progress. I wanted to believe him, because believing him meant everything was still intact. The partnership, the years of work, the respect. But unease doesn't disappear just because you ignore it. It settles in, waiting. I started pulling old reports, comparing them line by line with the new ones, noticing patterns that didn't scream fraud but whispered intent. Funds moving through shell entities we'd never discussed. Consulting fees approved without board review. Expenses categorized just vaguely enough to escape immediate scrutiny. Each discovery tightened something in my chest, not panic but recognition. Mark hadn't taken the money in one bold move. He had bled it out slowly, assuming I was too focused on operations, too trusting, or too tired to trace the trail back to him. I did confront Mark when the numbers confirmed what my instincts already knew. I closed my laptop, poured myself a glass of water, and let the truth settle without drama. Because confrontation, I had learned over decades in business, is rarely the most effective first move. It alerts the other person, gives them time to adjust, to hide, to rewrite the story. Instead, I did what I had always done when a system showed signs of failure. I audited it quietly. I requested historical records under the pretense of preparing for an upcoming compliance review. I asked our legal counsel for copies of agreements I hadn't looked at in years, framing it as housekeeping. I scheduled meetings with department heads individually, not to accuse, but to listen. And slowly, unmistakably, the full picture emerged. Mark hadn't just redirected money, he had isolated control. He positioned himself as the sole decision-maker in places that mattered, assuming I'd remain focused on operations and never question authority I thought we still shared. The amount, $900,000, was staggering not because of its size, but because of the arrogance behind it. He believed that time, familiarity, and my quiet nature had made me predictable. What he never considered was that predictability is only dangerous when it's mistaken for complacency. Once I understood the full scope of what Mark had done, my focus shifted from discovery to design. Anger would have been easier, it always is, but anger clouds judgment, and I needed mine razor sharp. I spent nights reviewing partnership agreements we'd signed decades earlier, documents Mark likely hadn't thought about in years. Clauses most people skim past become powerful when read slowly, in the right moment. There it was, exactly as I remembered drafting it back when the company was young and fragile. A provision requiring unanimous consent for fund reallocation above a certain threshold, regardless of internal restructuring. Mark had counted on complexity to bury accountability, but complexity also preserves fingerprints. I consulted an independent forensic accountant under confidentiality, someone with no loyalty to Mark or the firm's public image. Together, we traced the flow of money with surgical precision, building a timeline that didn't rely on emotion or assumption, just facts. Dates, authorizations, signatures, gaps where consent should have existed and didn't. With every verified entry, my resolve hardened. This wasn't about revenge in the theatrical sense. It was about correction, about restoring balance where someone had assumed it could be tipped permanently in their favor. And as the evidence stacked neatly into folders, I felt something steadier than anger take hold, a certainty that Mark's confidence was built on a foundation he no longer controlled. The timing mattered as much as the evidence, and I was careful not to rush it. Mark had grown comfortable, too comfortable. He spoke more freely in meetings, dismissed concerns with casual authority, and began making plans that assumed his version of ownership was already settled. I let him. I nodded through strategy sessions, approved routine decisions, and even praised his leadership in front of others. Not because I meant it, but because confidence makes people careless. While he was busy expanding, I was quietly positioning the pieces that would expose exactly how far he'd gone. I arranged a scheduled internal review under the guise of preparing for potential investors, something Mark had been eager about for months. He welcomed the idea, believing it would validate his control and increase the company's valuation. What he didn't know was that I had already shared selected documents with legal counsel, ensuring that when questions were asked, the answers would be unavoidable. This wasn't a trap sprung in anger. It was a door opened wide and politely, allowing the truth to walk in on its own. The review meeting unfolded exactly the way I anticipated, not because I controlled it, but because Mark underestimated how clearly systems speak when given the chance. The consultants asked their questions calmly, methodically, moving through projections, cash flow, and governance structures with professional detachment. At first, Mark answered confidently, leaning back in his chair, joking lightly, performing the role he had perfected over the years. But then the questions narrowed. They asked about specific transfers, about consulting fees routed through entities not disclosed in earlier reports, about approvals that bypassed the consent threshold outlined in the partnership agreement. I watched Mark's posture change almost imperceptibly, shoulders tightening, fingers tapping, his voice slowing as he searched for explanations that no longer aligned. When one consultant asked who had authorized a particular reallocation totaling just under $900,000, the room went quiet. Mark glanced at me, expecting support, a shared front, the old instinctive loyalty. I met his eyes and said nothing. I didn't need to. The documents spoke louder than I ever could. In that silence, the illusion of his control cracked, not explosively, but decisively. He realized then that this wasn't a misunderstanding he could smooth over or a conversation he could redirect. It was accountability arriving without emotion, and it terrified him far more than anger ever would have. After that meeting, the shift was unmistakable. Mark stopped calling as often. His emails became shorter, more careful, stripped of the casual confidence he once relied on. He knew the ground beneath him had changed, even if he didn't yet know how far it would collapse. Behind the scenes, the process moved exactly as planned. Legal counsel initiated a formal review based on the findings, citing breaches that could no longer be framed as oversight or misunderstanding. I stayed present but quiet, answering questions when asked, providing documentation without commentary. There was no satisfaction in watching Mark unravel, only a steady sense of alignment. For the first time in years, the company was no longer drifting under someone else's ambition. It was being anchored again in the principles we had built it on. When Mark finally asked to meet privately, his tone was different. No charm, no confidence, just urgency. He spoke about stress, about pressure, about how things had gotten away from him. I listened without interruption, then told him calmly that intentions didn't erase actions, and trust, once broken, doesn't reset simply because someone feels exposed. The partnership, as it once existed, was over. What remained would be decided by facts, not feelings. The final outcome didn't come with raised voices or dramatic ultimatums. It came in writing. Mark's legal team proposed a settlement before any formal charges were filed, a quiet acknowledgement that the evidence left little room for defense. The terms were precise: restitution of the diverted funds, immediate resignation from his executive role, and a permanent separation from decision-making authority within the company. I reviewed the proposal slowly, line by line, not out of hesitation but respect for the gravity of what was closing. When I signed, I didn't feel triumph. I felt resolution. The money returned where it belonged, but more importantly, the structure of the company was corrected. Employees who had sensed tension but never understood it finally saw stability restored. Operations resumed without the constant undercurrent of manipulation. And Mark, once so confident that familiarity would protect him, walked away smaller than he arrived, undone not by my anger, but by my refusal to look away. In that moment, I understood something deeply. Real revenge doesn't seek to destroy the other person. It simply removes their ability to take from you ever again. Life didn't become quieter after that, it became clearer. I returned to my routines with a steadiness I hadn't felt in years, not because everything was perfect, but because nothing was hidden anymore. Trust, I learned, isn't restored by apologies or explanations. It's rebuilt through boundaries that don't bend under pressure. Mark never reached out again. He didn't need to. His absence was the confirmation. I continued forward with my work, my relationships, and my sense of self intact, knowing I had faced betrayal without becoming bitter and reclaimed what was mine without losing who I was. And if there's one truth this journey left me with, it's this: when you stop shrinking to keep others comfortable, the world adjusts, and what remains is a life finally lived on your own terms. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted, or felt quietly pushed aside while others took what you built, remember this: strength doesn't always shout, and revenge doesn't always destroy. Sometimes the most powerful victory is reclaiming your dignity and walking forward without fear. If you believe in stories that honor patience, wisdom, and quiet justice, subscribe to Silver Reckoning Hub and stay with us. These aren't just stories of revenge. They're reminders that no matter your age or situation, your voice still matters, and it's never too late to take your power back.